One of my reading goals for this year was to annotate more. I've done a little bit of tabbing, but I have never done, other than in scholarly pursuit, highlighting and doodling and writing in the margin of fiction books. So, with that in mind, I went to the store and I chose a book that I believed was fraught with magical realism, sort of a love letter to books and bookshop owners. And that book is The Lost Bookshop by Evie Woods. Before I go much further, I did want to stop to take a moment to talk a little bit about magical realism. Magical realism is a novel that is set in our world, but there are sort of unexplainable elements within that plot. So, for instance, in The Lost Bookshop, we've got a house on the street that's labeled 10 and 12. There's supposed to be an 11, but you can't find it. And so there's obviously some sort of magical element that is preventing sight of this bookshop. Sometimes in magical realism stories, there's an ability to converse with people who are supposed to have passed on. They're no longer living on Earth, but you're still able to communicate with them. And so there's something that's sort of unexplainable, but it's set within the confines of our world. The second part to magical realism is that it actually deals with pretty heavy topics. So it's not light, cozy, low stakes. There are magical elements, but it is dealing with some heavy topics. So that's the thing to remember with a book that has magical realism is you are going to come across some heavy hitting topics. The Lost Bookshop was published in 2023, and in this we follow three main characters, Opaline, Martha, and Henry. The timeline for Opaline is in the 1920s, and Martha and Henry are in the present. And we get each of their points of view sprinkled throughout this story. This is set predominantly in Dublin, as Evie Wood is an Irish writer whose real name is actually Evie Gauguin. But we do have some scenes that are set in Paris. I decided to use 4 different tabs to mean 4 different things and to have 2 different highlighters meaning other things. And I started to highlight and doodle and put tabs in. So my tabs represented hope, despair, love, and research, which is one of the reasons why I loved this book. And my highlighters would represent beautiful writing and literary references. Opaline in 1920 has to run away from her family in order to avoid a marriage to a man that she does not want to marry. She makes it all the way to Paris, and something that I love so much is that Opaline works for Sylvia Beach, who is the founder and owner of Shakespeare and Company, which was a avant-garde bookshop run by American Sylvie Beach in Paris during the time of the golden writers era in Paris. And so we have Hemingway and James Joyce. Sylvia Beach actually became a publishing house and published James Joyce's work because he was not able to find a traditional publisher. So just a intriguing way to kind of pull Opaline into a real live literary story, having her work there. And then she has to depart again because her family finds her and tries to force her again into marriage. Opaline flees to Dublin and manages to come across somebody who owns a emporium type shop, and she starts to pull books and book dealings into what she's selling at the emporium. As we move into the present day with Martha and Henry, Martha, similar to Opaline, is also fleeing an abusive relationship. She ends up getting a job working for this kind of cantankerous older woman who needs a housekeeper and caretaker. And Martha does this all while kind of swallowing down the pain that she's going through from having fled this relationship. She did not flee it in a manner that was a clean break. She literally just ran and found this job. Henry, who is living in a boarding house nearby, is searching for the Lost Bookshop that is hidden between street numbered houses 10 and 12. There should be an 11. There is not. And so he ends up developing a friendship with Martha, sharing his thesis, his idea about this missing bookshop, while Martha is really trying to heal through her life. Through all of that, they start to discover Opaline's footprint through life and her connection potentially with this Lost Bookshop. I would highly recommend picking up the Lost Bookshop. Just be aware there are triggers. One of the topics in the Lost Bookshop is the asylums that females were put into during the early 1900s, when you had a female who was not behaving in a manner that society had deemed proper. One of the solutions was to put her into an asylum, and the asylums had abysmal conditions. There is also child loss that is handled in here. We've got two women who are running from abusive relationships, one of which the abuse is on page. It's not super detailed, but it's there. Just realize that there are trigger warnings in this, but it was so phenomenal. Annotating this book really has left an indelible mark in my reading life. It is a book I will never forget reading. I'm so glad that I chose this book and this author to have this experience with. And I loved Evie Wood's work so much that I decided to read more of her works for the Irish Readathon that is held every March. Evie Woods also wrote The Story Collector, which is her most recent work. And in The Story Collector, we actually, and this is how it fits into the Irish Readathon, we actually have a story that is set in Ireland, and it is about a story collector who is a young man who's traveling around Ireland and collecting stories of fae, basically the good people. And there's so much Irish folklore and stories in The Story Collector. I love how Evie Wood tied some of those stories into a dual timeline where we have someone in the past who's actually living through one of those stories, and then someone in the future who is who found the diary of this person and is unpacking kind of what happened and all of the mystery. The Story Collector also handles child loss and the dissolution of a marriage and parent loss. And it also has some pretty, when you hear about the good people in Ireland and the Fae and their involvement, they are not the gentle, cute, sexy Fae that we see a lot of times in modern literature. The Fae in Ireland are pretty harsh, and their interaction with humans show that, right? So there's like death and human babies that are being, the stories of changelings. So that story, I think, has a lot of that in it. In The Story Collector, there is an ability to converse with people who maybe have passed on. And I loved reading that for the Irish Readathon because I did learn more Irish folklore than I knew before. I loved the Irish countryside setting. So The Story Collector is also a phenomenal choice. I've also read The Mysterious Bakery on Rue de Paris, which is also by Evie Wood, but she self-published that book about 11 years ago. And because I think of the popularity of the Lost Bookshop, she is having that book now be republished traditionally. And so I was able to get that as an ARC through NetGalley to read that. I will say it is a great story. There's a lot of magical realism in it. I love the ethnic struggles that she portrays in this. This actually is set in Paris, wholly, but I do think that you can see her growth from something that she wrote 11 years ago versus The Lost Bookshop and even The Story Collector. You can see her maturity in writing. But The Mysterious Bakery of Rue de Prairie is also fabulous. And I actually think I would actually suggest it more as a cozier magical realism story. That I think is probably your lightest read. There are still some ethnic cleansing topics that are discussed in that are very hard to read as well. But overall, it's probably the lightest read. Additionally, there are other authors that I wanted to recommend. So I just finished an arc of The Alchemy of Flowers by Lara Resau, which is coming out in July. And that, I believe, is her first adult novel, but it has a lot of magical realism in it. We have a main character who, again, is running from a dissolved marriage. That book very much delves into child loss. I think that it could be cathartic to read through how this character handled that, because she really took her pain and walked through it. And you do walk through it with her, but you also see other characters who had similar pain who did not come through it healthy. So it really does show you very glaringly what happens when you don't take your pain and acknowledge it and try to find healthy strategies for working through it. The story is really beautiful. It's about a young woman who gives up everything and moves basically to this like secret garden type environment. She lives in a tree house. There are other people who are living there who live in like yurts and caravans. And it's just really, I love how we set up the living arrangements in this garden. There is also a very large manor, like a castle almost with turrets. And that's where the main patron of the gardens, the person who runs it, lives, but we don't actually see her. There is, because it's adult, there's definitely some sexual content in it, but it's not super open door. But there is definitely, you understand what's happening as it's being described. The description of the food, of the flowers. But the magical realism part of this is that one of the characters has an ability to communicate with flowers. And I loved that part so much. So The Alchemy of Flowers is a great magical realism book to try if you're interested in that type of a genre. And then additionally, I did want to share, I always talk about Sarah Addison Allen. So far, every book that I've read of hers has magical realism in it, and I've enjoyed them all. I would say probably start with garden spells. And again, there are some heavy-ish topics in here, like fleeing from an abusive relationship and kind of the perils with that. But the garden spells, as well as First Frost, which is the second book in that series, are two phenomenal toe dips in magical realism with Sarah Addison Allen. I also wanted to mention The Girl at the Window. This is by Rowan Coleman. If you have a love of Emily Bronte, I think this would be a really great magical realism choice for you. In this, we have a mother and her son who return back to the house that Emily Bronte visited as a child, that her mother owns and that she grew up in. And the house itself has its own kind of quirkiness and intricacies. It ends up that there's a lot that goes on in here. And again, with that dual timeline and being able to kind of communicate with characters who supposedly should have passed on but haven't. So I really enjoyed this and found myself really kind of gripped by the plot and wanting to find out what was going to happen. And so this is another really great option for trying out the magical realism genre. And lastly, I would suggest The Book Charmer by Karen Hawkins. In this, we follow Sarah Dove. She's a librarian and she has a special magical realism skill, which is she just sort of intuitively knows when a specific book needs to be read by a certain person. So when Grace Wheeler arrives into town, she's taking care of her, I think, foster mother and her niece, Daisy. Sarah gets a message that she needs to deliver to Grace. Grace isn't necessarily receptive to that, and so they have to kind of figure it out. This does, again, in that whole magical realism genre, deal with dementia, Alzheimer's, PTSD, parent loss, a lot of hard topics, but it handles it very gently and wonderfully, and so this might be a book for you to try out as well. Let me know if you have any magical realism recommendations to give to me. Let me know if you've read any of these and have loved them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.